With us today is Bill Drake. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Dick.
Nice of you to come.
Privileged to be here.
Yeah. Bill is a Grass Valley resident. He's been on local radio, lectured in several places here and around the country, and held workshops in high schools and in colleges, some of them on the East Coast. Is that Old Dominion?
Old Dominion University is usually my book with some of their classes.
Okay. And it's on something that really affects us all, racism and prejudice. Could it be more timely? He's the author of a book that I've been looking at, and it's all dog-eared. But it's called Almost Hereditary, A White Southerner's Journey Out of Racism, A Guide for Unlearning and Healing Prejudice. It's really a good read and unique because of Bill's heritage. Can you tell us about why do you have it subtitled, or titled rather, Almost Hereditary?
Okay, thank you, Dick. Well, I have a particularly unique background. My mother grew up in the early 1900s. She was raised in the old plantation way with a black mammy, a woman who was born in slavery. Mm-hmm. She was very proud of My mother's very proud of her ancestors. On her mother's side, there are at least 3 generations of slave plantation owners.
Yeah, a lot of tradition there.
A lot of tradition. On her father's side, my great-grandfather was a Civil War hero and a Mississippi State Senator that helped create some of the laws that oppressed black people. So this was a heritage that I was born into. I was taught to be prejudiced at a very early age through the behavior of my parents, the teachings of my parents. It was almost hereditary. Of course, people aren't born with prejudice, but in my family, it's about as close as you can get. You know, it was
Really?
Passed down the generations one after another. So that's pretty much how I came into the world and how I grew up, believing in white supremacy and
Yeah. Well, that's a
like
tough
that.
background. A lot of people, I don't remember anyone that's really is writing from that perspective. But what's the difference between racism and prejudice? I didn't get that quite.
Sure. Well, prejudice generally is where we have beliefs about other people because of misinformation or partial information. Racism is one of many forms of prejudice.
Oh, okay.
It tends to be in the news a lot. It's been in our history ever since the colonial days, and something that's been involved in a lot of current news programs. So racism's also often talked about specifically, but there are many forms of prejudice.
Well, what would you say would be the forms of prejudice that you grew up under, and examples of them that you racism that you grew up under in the South?
Sure.
We've seen some of them, but I'm not sure.
Right. Well, particularly prejudice against black people, that was predominant. But in my family, we were actually taught to be prejudiced against anybody we thought was particularly different from us. So that included
all-encompassing?
Pretty much everybody, Jewish people, Catholic people, foreigners, because of the Civil War, Northerners, which...
Westerners, maybe?
They probably wouldn't have liked Californians. You know, essentially anybody, any group that we thought was significantly different. But there was definitely a white supremacist viewpoint in there.
Wow. And how about in this area, in Nevada County now? It's quite different here, but are there forms of racism or prejudice that you perceive here?
Certainly. Well, not that long ago, a few months ago, we had a black family that was chased out of Rollins Lake, out of the campground at Rollins Lake, by a white person who was yelling racist slogans.
Okay. Not okay, but I understand.
Sure. Several years ago, there was a Hispanic family in Condon Park in Grass Valley that was chased out of that park by white youth. So we definitely have our share of racism in our county, and prejudice, of course, is a human phenomena. So we always have prejudices of different sorts as well, and that's certainly true in our county.
It's a difficult thing to deal with, regardless of
Certainly,
where we come from, I think.
it's a human thing. We all have our prejudices, but when it isn't understood or recognized and acted out in the world, obviously can be very damaging, very
Yeah.
hurtful.
Could you tell me a little more about your background? You've told us about your heritage and all that sort of thing, but how does a white child brought up in that environment, could you tell us about that, and then how you happen to change over into have a different perspective?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, from the time I was born, racism and prejudice was modeled in my family, and that related to teachings, but also if we would drive downtown, my mother and I, and she saw black people, immediately she'd lock the car doors, so there was something to fear.
So you knew there was something up.
There was behaviors that made it evident that there was something wrong with other people, other races. My world I grew up in, I was born in 1945 and grew up in what was called the Jim Crow South, which was from the late 1800s to the mid-60s.
Okay,
And during that time period, everything was segregated.
sure.
So I went to school with all white people, except for after court-ordered integration in the late 1950s. There was one black child I had occasion to go to school with. So everything was separate. All the laws supported white supremacy. And so that was my physical environment, my social environment that reinforced my family teaching.
Okay.
So all that came together.
What happened to make a change in your perspective?
Well, when I was a teenager, first of all, in my early mid-teenage years, I did things that were hurtful to black people. For example, driving through a black neighborhood and yelling derogatory names.
Oh.
When I was 17, which was in 1962, I grew up in Virginia. I was riding a bus across Virginia with one of my cousins from Mississippi. And there happened to be a black woman sitting in front of him, which during most of our lives would have been illegal. And during that entire bus ride, my cousin just kicked the back of that woman's seat. At that point, even though I'd been raised to believe in white supremacy and that black people were inferior, I'd also been raised to be kind, and it brought up a conflict in me, the act of unkindness that was so obvious. It left me very, very unsettled. And I don't remember thinking about it a lot, but about a year and a half later, I was riding in a car with one of my older brothers, and I just turned to him and said, "Is it right to look down on other people simply because they're a different race from us?" And his answer was just the word no. And that conversation, as short as it was, changed my life.
Wow.
It gave me permission to let go of a belief in white supremacy. I still had conditioned racism from my childhood, and I still have that today.
So you work at it today.
But at that point, I let go of that belief system.
Yeah.
And
Well, from
sort of
there
life
to
work.
the book. Now, the book deals with a good deal with that, but then it gets into some things about how to unlearn. So you've had a mission for a while somehow. It isn't like you just said, well, I'm not going to do that anymore, I'm not going to behave that way or whatever, but you've actually had kind of a mission to help other people unlearn those issues, those beliefs. Could you tell us about that?
Well, certainly because of my background and my experience of having been on both sides of racism, it gives me a perspective a lot of people don't have, and also it's something I've had to deal with throughout my life, so it's something I feel I've learned a lot about and have things I can offer other people and help other people. So it's become a passion of sorts and a focus of my life to work on myself and help other people unlearn prejudice.
Well, how did you come to write the book? That's what I wanted to know, because the book is not just a autobiographical treatise. It really goes into a great deal of it is dealing with the sources that you have for your beliefs that are in the book, but also a great deal of, I would call them workshop helpers that are, I think there's like 100 questions in there.
That's right.
That help college students and college teachers and high school do workshops. So how did you get to that point?
Sure. Well, originally I wrote the book about 12 years ago.
Oh.
And it came out of doing a lot of radio programs related to my family, related to racism, civil rights.
That's
program.
KVMR?
On KVMR every year on their
Okay.
annual Martin Luther King Day. I
Okay.
did programming, helped oversee the programming at times.
Mhm.
At some point I felt I wanted to write something to put together what I'd learned and try to share that with others to be helpful
Okay.
to others. So originally I wrote the book and it was almost finished, and I went through some personal changes, and I came to feel it wasn't quite what I felt I wanted to say. So I put it aside. And then a few years ago, I wrote a front page story for the Union newspaper. The editor at that time learned about my manuscript and
Who was
asked.
that?
That was Jeff Ackerman.
Oh,
And he asked if
Yes.
he could borrow it and read it.
Sure.
And then he came back and said, I should really publish this. And then another person I knew who was a former school principal read it and came back and said, everybody should read this book. And by then I was doing work in our community on unlearning prejudice and felt I had a lot more I could say and put together that could be useful to others. And it was at that point I spent about a year rewriting the book.
wow. Well, it's a really, I would advise reading that. It really is a very effective book. It's Almost Hereditary, a white Southerner's journey out of racism, a guide to unlearning and healing prejudice. It's, as I said, a huge bibliography and appendix in their very helpful book. It's available at local bookstores, internet stores, and Bill's website, which is www.healracism.com, appropriately named. www.healracism.com. What next steps are you going to get into?
Well, a few years ago, I co-founded a group called Creating Communities Beyond Bias, which works in our community with particularly high school students on helping unlearn prejudice. We do workshops and we've done forums and things of that nature. And currently we're working on a project of bringing together different representatives of different segments of our community,
Oh,
which we hope to do in the spring to look at ways to diminish prejudice, create more unity within our county and our community.
okay, so onward with the mission.
That's it.
All right. Well,
Thank you
thanks
so much.
very much. I appreciate your coming
Appreciate
down.
your time.
Yes.